Hello everyone, this is Greg Scorzo and you're listening to the Kodo Publishing Podcast number 6. Today we're going to be doing The Art of Thinking with Elizabeth Hobson. For those of you who don't know, Elizabeth Hobson is a writer and gender equality activist who also happens to be an individualist, a libertarian, and the former communications director for Justice for Men and Boys. And she is now the director of media relations for Justice for Men and Boys. In this podcast, we'll be talking about radical versus mainstream feminists, woke culture, statistical inequalities between men and women, traditional conservatism, big tech censorship, the history of chivalry, misandry, sexual harassment, feminist etiquette, the value of female beauty, and the ethics of slut-shaming. Are you a feminist now? No.
I'm an anti-feminist gender equality activist.
Okay, so when you said I've changed my mind about feminism, you didn't mean that in the past year you've become a feminist.
No, I mean like 10 years ago, I identified as a feminist for a brief, unfortunate phase.
Yeah. Well, you know what? So did I. Between 1998 and 2013, I self-identified as a feminist, and I even did a very embarrassing set of feminist vlogs that you can still see.
Yeah, I did take my blog down in its entirety. It was when I started working as the director of communications for J4MB.
That's Justice for Men and Boys?
Yeah, it was, and the leader of the party at the time requested that I took the blog down. But until then, I'd kept up my super cringy couple of feminist pieces. There was one called Daddy's Little Second-Class Citizen. And then there was another called Why Every Feminist Should Also Be a Men's Rights Activist.
Yeah, that was kind of how I was thinking towards the end of my feminism. And the fact that...
Let's reform feminism.
Yeah, the fact that I got so much guff for kind of wanting similar standards of treatment for men and women as a feminist was one of the things that pushed me out of feminism.
Same.
That's interesting. I don't know if you've had similar experiences to this, but when I was a feminist from the 90s to about 2013, there were sort of like the radical feminists who were like feminism today, but like a preview of feminism today. But most feminists were sort of, at least the ones that I interacted with, they weren't really people that were pushing the idea that like women were oppressed by men. They were sort of pushing the idea that we should get rid of gender norms and that maybe men's rights and women's rights could come together and have some sort of harmonious relationship in the 21st century. What I found is by about 2014, it seemed like the radical feminists that I had always sort of dismissed as sort of like fringe people that you would find at liberal arts colleges, they became not just the mainstream of the left, they became pop culture, they became education, they became Hollywood, they became the BBC. And their attitude was just absolutely hateful, misandric, bitter, sexist in the extreme, paranoid, and they normally didn't have arguments. They normally bullied people whenever there was any kind of a discussion at all. It was all bullying, and it was all a combination of bullying and what felt like kind of like Scientology head games they were playing with you. And when that happened, I had to think for a year or so, am I like a feminist who doesn't like contemporary feminism? Do I want to keep saying I'm a feminist, but... Or do I think this has become something like an authoritarian hate movement and I want to be on the other side of it? And that's why I left feminism. Why did you leave feminism?
Well, I mean, before I go into that, I would like to say that I feel that we have a slight possible difference of definition.
Okay.
So with regards to radical feminism and mainstream feminism, for me, I today prefer radical feminists. I find them to be honest. I've looked back into the annals of feminist history, and mainstream feminists like Gloria Steinem have made a career of censoring radical feminists. And so the question that a lot of people have these days, which goes something like, are radical feminists really free speech activists, or are they just annoyed because they can't say that women have XX chromosomes?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and whether it is self-interest or not, they have been free speech activists since the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's kind of enough for me on that front. But also radical feminists, I find to be, you mentioned the word bitter. They're definitely bitter. Hate-filled or hateful, they are that. But they're also honest.
Mm-hmm.
And so, whereas a mainstream feminist, if you bring an idea like fathers are disadvantaged in family courts to a mainstream feminist, she will say something like, oh, that's a form of misogyny where women are believed to be nurturing and not capable of earning money, but their place is in the home, and it's really misogyny, and we need to make fathers take care of their children more, and that would change the assumption.
Mm-hmm.
Whilst actively campaigning against anything that would fix the situation. So, for example, you had a few years ago a report by Women's Aid in consultation with CAFCAS called 19 Child Homicides. And I mean, I think it's fair to say, that Women's Aid are mainstream. But what they did in that report was to very carefully cherry pick 19 occasions wherein families had been in family courts, abuse had been alleged by the mother against the father, and the father had then gone on to murder like his child or children,
Mm-hmm.
or their children. And what they obfuscated, I mean, the report, so the gist of the report was that in family court, if there are allegations of abuse levied against a father, he is a direct risk to his children's lives, and so he must be kept away. What they failed to mention was that, in actual fact, mothers and fathers present a fairly equal risk to their children's lives. The numbers of children, who are thankfully very few, but the number murdered by parents, it's fairly equal between mothers and fathers. And actually, when there was an outcry about how biased this report was, and in fact, that an interesting point was that one of the cases of women killing their children that this report failed to mention occurred just before the report was published, and it was actually a woman who was living within one of Women's Aid's shelters.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there was an outcry about how biased this report was, and CAFCAS then looked at it again, and not only did they disavow the findings of the report, but they discovered that in actual fact, not only are allegations of abuse made by mothers against fathers in family court not evidence that the fathers are necessarily a risk to their children's lives,
Mm-hmm.
but that allegations of abuse in family courts are more likely than not to be covering up who the actual abuser is.
Right.
They're more likely to be false, and actually taking them as gospel without findings of fact that are appropriate. That is putting children's lives at risk.
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads
Well-being.
that leads to what I found out after I left feminism, which is that what I thought was moderate, regular, ordinary feminism was actually horrendously, awfully radical. And that radical feminism, which you described earlier, it was too, but it had a few things that were maybe slightly better than the regular variant that was in popular culture.
Yeah, I mean, so radical feminists, on the other hand, they are at least honest, and they do think, or, you know, a lot of them have very misandric ideas. But what they don't do is pretend that they're on men's side.
Mm-hmm. They play less mind
you know,
games.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm happy to have conversations with honest radicals
Mm-hmm.
in any sphere. What is not valuable time well spent, in my opinion, is talking to dishonest people, really. And obviously, I think it's very disturbing and toxic that these dishonest feminists represent a very dominant lobby politically.
Do you think that modern mainstream feminism, which initially I thought was radical just because it was so awful, but it turns out it was mainstream, do you think that this movement is in a way almost like a kind of fundamentalist religion?
Yeah, 100%. It's got all the hallmarks of a religion. There is a really good piece by Janice Fiamengo on the website Anti-Feminist Praxis.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I forget the exact title, but it essentially argues that feminism is a religion. And, you know, so she points out that you have a kind of utopian Garden of Eden story where there was egalitarianism and then a fall wherein patriarchal men decided to, you know, impose themselves on women and organize society for their benefit. Then we have the, you know, good and evil, men and women, patriarchal, feminist. It's so dogmatic in the way that fundamentalist religions are, because, like you, I was identifying as a feminist, and I maintain to this day that I'm not an unreasonable person. And when I talk to average Jane and Joe, they're not horrified by the things I say. And, you know, I feel like I'm a pretty progressive person who wants equal rights and treatment and choices for men and women, which would appear to be consistent with the dictionary definition of feminism. And yet, so much of what I think is so incredibly triggering to the average feminist, and they're so unwilling to even enter into an honest dialogue about it.
To give you to give you an example of how even I can feel that from the other end of the screen. When you sent me the articles that you wanted to talk about for this podcast, and I put them into Facebook to try and link into them, Facebook told me they were hate speech.
I know.
So I couldn't even read your articles on my Facebook browser. I had to do a new browser to read them.
Yeah.
And I was so shocked because I thought, okay, if they're hate speech...
You must have been like really excited, like, God, this is going to be so outrageous. And then you must have been really disappointed.
I wasn't disappointed because I liked the content. I thought it was fascinating. I was disappointed at Facebook for even considering what you had written controversial. It was pretty... it was interesting and I thought important to discuss, obviously, but it was the furthest thing away from anything that I would think of as misogyny. And I don't like misogyny because I'm in love with a woman. Most of my friends are women. My mother's a woman. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't want to live in a society where people hate women or hate men either. But this idea that if you challenge the orthodoxies of, like, I don't know, the BBC, education, the corporate world on this issue, which are now totally feminist, you're treated like you're almost like a part of the KKK or something. It's really weird.
Well, that's exactly what it is. So the reason that you couldn't access my articles is because the Southern Poverty Law Centre has categorised A Voice for Men, the most visited men's human rights website in the world as a hate group, and Facebook has gone, oh right, okay, and the Southern Poverty Law Centre's list, we are literally alongside Ku Klux Klan. That is who they have put us alongside, and it's very troubling. And Laura Bates in Men Who Hate Women,
the lovely Laura Bates.
The lovely Laura Bates, she suggests that there is a slippery slope that exists from men's rights activism to white nationalism. There is no such link. It's absolutely ridiculous. There is no logical kind of continuum that goes from thinking men and women should have equal rights and treatment and choices to thinking that we should live in racially segregated nations. But actually, by putting a voice for men on the list of hate groups, the Southern Poverty Law Centre is tacitly kind of suggesting that it's legitimizing groups like the KKK, because anyone who looks at a voice for men is going to find a lot of acceptable, reasonable, thoughtful material. And if they then realize that, oh, look, this website, which is all right, has been designated as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Centre, aren't they going to then have less unfavourable opinions or a sort of scepticism about everyone else on the list? So
yeah, well, my suspicion is they want that. They want people who are in the men's rights movement to sort of mingle and hang out with and take seriously white supremacists, so that they can more easily lump them together when getting polite society to reject them and hate them and want to stigmatize them.
Or perhaps they are hoping that people who are in the men's rights movement, or we're not the only kind of collective that they have unfairly branded as hate groups or whatever, maybe they are hoping that they can kind of, and maybe it's subconscious, maybe they're hoping that they can push us towards genuinely disgraceful kind of ideas to justify their existence, because their raison d'etre is to fight against bigotry.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, perhaps there's a part of them who is invested in maintaining or even nurturing bigotry.
Absolutely. They get very upset if you even suggest that things are getting better.
Exactly, which is exactly what Steven Pinker found when he published Enlightenment Now and started talking about that, was that, I hate to say the left wing, it certainly came from the left wing. I'm not right wing. I'm a libertarian with views on either side, and I have friends that are explicitly left wing and very reasonable, good people. But the sort of radical left, which is quite dominant in the left these days, they didn't want to hear his message.
So Steven Pinker, for our listeners, is a scientist who wrote a book recently about how if you analyzed all sorts of statistics about the world, about poverty, about the environment, about agriculture, longevity, health, and so on, what you see is not the impression that you get from activists, which is that things are getting worse. What you see is actually things are getting much better, although there are still problems to be solved. And when he put out this material, he was treated like a de facto right-wing extremist in many circles by many journalists, writers, and activists who were so outraged by what he said that he wound up becoming a sort of de facto member of the intellectual dark web alongside Jordan Peterson and lots of other more conservative figures. Just because he took this stance that you would think in theory was compatible with being either left or right wing, but the left wouldn't have it.
It was. And I mean, you know, the introduction kind of put me off because, like, honestly, he must have criticized Donald Trump like 3 times just in the introduction. And I was like, for God's sake, like, is this just going to be a not? But, you know, I would have thought, and perhaps he put it in there to butter certain people up.
I think so. But yeah, no, Pinker is very. I genuinely believe that he is sort of a center left person, so it would make sense that he would
Absolutely
write negatively about Trump to sort of preamble his book and try and get people on his side to be less hostile towards it. But it seemed to me that what he, at least initially, didn't take into account, maybe he's taking it into account now, I'm not sure, but the mainstream left is like somebody who hasn't taken medication. They seem psychotic.
Yeah. And there is reason for that. There's good reason for that. They are very deliberately seeming to foster within their own minds and the minds of their peers dysfunctional patterns of thought that any psychotherapist would be intending to dissuade people away from, which, you know, I know is something we'll probably cover in the subsequent episode together when we talk about how you can be a social justice warrior. And it's what Lukianov and Haidt talk about in their book, Coddling of the American Mind.
Yes.
So it's the kind of dichotomous thinking and fatalism and the biases, you know?
Yeah, well, I don't know how you feel about this. I think we all have different reactions to this. I started out on the left, and I still to this day defend some left-wing ideas. Like I defended the welfare state in a debate with the libertarian economist Joran Brook a couple of days ago. So I have no bones about defending left-wing ideas, even to this day. But I would not today consider myself part of the left, because my feeling is that independently of whether or not there are some left-wing positions I agree with, the psychology of the left at the moment, if you were to let it run wild, it would create something like a 21st century version of Nazi Germany. That's my fear. Because the psychology of Nazi Germany and the modern left to me seem very similar.
I don't think that's hyperbole. And like you, there are a fair quantity of certainly traditionally left-wing ideas that I endorse. You know, I mean, freedom of speech used to be a left-wing issue.
It was, even when I was a kid.
I don't know what happened to that. And then criminal justice reform, I'm really into. I'm a bleeding heart liberal when it comes to issues like that, because when you look at like the Bromley briefings, fact files and stuff, the vast majority of prisoners, be they male or female, have, you know, experienced a lot of disadvantage in their lives, like abuse and addiction, and they've struggled at school, they've been jobless, they've been homeless, they've had mental health problems. And all of these things, in my opinion, not only should provoke some compassion from the rest of us, but actually present us with opportunities to help them to become productive members of society rather than antisocial members of society. And there's a really good, I'm really into Johnny Cash's prison gigs.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got a documentary from about his Folsom prison series of gigs. And one of the people that's interviewed in it is a former prisoner there who saw Johnny Cash live. And one of the things he said that's always stuck with me is, like, you know, almost everyone who we send to prison will one day be free. And I think that's really important to remember, because there are very few crimes that, even if we are being as punitive as possible, are going to justify life in prison. And so what do we want to do? Do we want to punish them harshly and treat them like scum and make people who may well justifiably feel disenfranchised in society even before they get to prison feel further dehumanized?
Right.
Or do we want to try and help them to become better so they can come out and be better? This is a men's issue more than anything, because women are treated far more like human beings in the criminal justice system. In fact, in some cases, it might even be that women are treated too leniently in some cases in the criminal justice system.
Right.
There's a big disparity, you know, if according to William Collins at the Illustrated Empathy Gap, if men were treated as leniently by the criminal justice system as women, then 5 out of 6 male prisoners would be free.
So do you feel like it's easier for you to try and win these arguments where you might want to push a liberal position by actually getting sort of conservatives and libertarians on your side? Because the left just erupts in psychotic rage if you even say the word men in relationship to any kind of activism that you want to do that isn't punishing men.
I find that libertarians and conservatives are much more willing to have a meaningful dialogue with me. And even when they disagree with my conclusions, there is an open-hearted, open-minded exchange of ideas where we can learn something from each other, even if we don't come together in the end. Whereas I find that a lot of people who are self-identifying as on the left, they just put boards up like as soon as, and in fact I would go so far, it's not even like they put the boards up as soon as, it's more like they don't listen, they just don't listen to anyone, not even each other. They listen for trigger words or phrases or possibly ideas if they're particularly gallant, but more likely just words and phrases that they can latch on to and go, you're a bigot and I don't need to listen to you because I'm better than you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've certainly observed that as well. And there's also, as you've pointed out, there's even infighting. So now on the left, there's infighting between feminists who agree with trans rights and feminists who don't. It's a very difficult time, in a way, to be able to feel like the world is not in some way trying to mess with your head. Because if you turn on the television, no matter what the program is, even if it's the one show, every 10 minutes you're just going to be hounded with some sort of progressive message or some, even more explicit social justice ideology coming at you.
Speaking of that, I was talking to my best friend from when I was like 15 earlier, and his work is within systems acquisition, and he knows all about weapons manufacture and supply and all stuff like this. And he noticed that a company, I'm not sure of the name, but they're a company who sell ballistic missiles. And on their logo, they've added a pride flag.
Oh my God.
I mean, what does it all mean? It's insane.
Inclusive murder.
Yeah.
It's very disturbing because I mean, I love movies. I don't know if you love movies, but I love movies.
I love movies.
And I feel like in the last 2 to 3 years, if there's anything good that comes out of an English-speaking movie studio, either in England or in Hollywood, if there's anything decent, the critics get that it's actually pushing against the orthodoxies of our age in some way. But the cast and crew have to act like, no, it's not, and that they've made a feminist or an anti-racist or a woke movie. That seems like what had happened with Joker, with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Like, the cast and crew of these movies have to pretend it's woke. Such good films. And it seems like now, after COVID, there's even less chance for even slightly boundary-pushing movies to get made, because everything in the entertainment industry and Hollywood and the BBC is so super woke. It almost feels like it feels like I'm in some kind of a Scientology indoctrination camp whenever I turn on the telly or the radio. Do you ever feel that way?
Well, I like a lot of classic movies, and I like a lot of music. So I spend more time listening to music than watching films, and I spend more time watching classic films than modern films. I do turn on briefly in the mornings a bit of Sky News, because they've got the clock in the corner, which is quite handy.
Yeah.
But I am more likely to see pictures on my TV screen when my children are watching TV.
Right, right.
And when my children are watching TV, it's like a glorious sort of it's just great. And there are a lot of subversive creative artists and auteurs working on children's cartoons.
Really?
And so, the classic is the classic kind of emblematic piece of work out there is an episode of The Amazing World of Gumball. And in this episode, the main character, Gumball, Blue Cat, learns the art of tung fu. And tung fu is the art of destroying someone by using words. And he basically becomes woke. And the episode kind of culminates in him sitting in the canteen at school, and this flower walks over, who is a girl, and she sits down with him and starts having a conversation with him. And she mentions something about his white bread sandwich and says, brown bread is a little bit more healthy. And then he lashes back straight away that she is being classist or something like that, to that effect. And she says, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. And then it's, he suggests that she's being fattest, and she's being nice and kind, and he is just trying to destroy her. And in the end, she just looks at him and says, I forgive you. And he flies through the wall like someone's like, given him some kind of death punch or something. And he's knocked out and sees the error of his ways. And then there is all of the, YouTube content that kids are consuming. When I listen to my children and their friends trash talking, it curls my hair and it warms my heart. The schools are really pushing the indoctrination really, really, really hard. And it makes me absolutely furious when I find out the kind of misinformation and revisionist history and absolute, contested theories that Kemi Badenoch says are illegal to present as fact in schools. But they are overcooking it big time. And the kids are revolted and revolting. And so I think that perhaps, are you a millennial too? Am I right in thinking that?
Thank you, but no, I'm 41.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm a millennial, and just any older, and I wouldn't be. I'm like the first of the millennials. But we may well be lost, and we may be obnoxious, and we may make everybody miserable for a few more years. But when the kids who are like 15, 16, 12, when they come up through the ranks and start taking on positions in public life, things are going to be very, very different. They are based.
I hope so. I really, really hope so. Because to be perfectly honest, I'm a lot of the time psychologically disturbed by society. I'm psychologically disturbed by television. I'm psychologically disturbed by radio. I'm psychologically disturbed by what people do at award ceremonies like the BAFTAs, by the news, by education, higher and lower. It's kind of the only place I'm sort of semi-disturbed, and I'm not totally disturbed, is when I look at government. Because government is at least a mix of good and bad things. But every other aspect of society, I wonder if I'm being too kind of paranoid about it, because it seems like everyone is being taken over by a kind of mind virus that's making them say ridiculous, hateful, awful things all the time.
Yeah. I am disturbed to the extent that I know that lives are being ruined in all this. And if you look at the Me Too movement, for example, that is a movement with a traceable body count, both men, and also I know of at least one woman who was Jill Messick, who defended Harvey Weinstein and was bullied into suicide as a result. There was somewhere on the internet, there's a really moving piece by the wife of an orchestral conductor who killed himself, and she's devastated. And there's an idea that the Me Too movement is like a sisterhood thing. It's not about sisterhood. It's depriving women of their lives, women of their husbands, women of their sons, women of their fathers. So it's not about sisterhood. And I digress. I am disturbed because it's ruining lives now, but I'm not despairing and I'm not hopeless. I am convinced that however dark things may need to get, we are going to move in an onwards and upwards trajectory given time.
Well, I certainly hope you're right. So one of the things I wanted to have you on this podcast to do is to talk a little bit about your activism as a men's rights activist. I've known about you, I think, for good 4 or 5 years. I met you, I think, at the Battle of Ideas originally in
Correct.
2016 at a talk I was doing about a man who breaks up with his girlfriend because she's diagnosed as a psychopath. You were there.
It was very interesting too, yeah. What was it called now?
It was called Post-Socratic Dialogues Love, which is the
Yes,
title
that
of...
was it.
Yeah, that's my book, which is coming out on July 4th. That very thing is coming out now.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
I will be rushing out to buy that.
Well, thank you. But one of the reasons I've always been fascinated by your work and wanted to talk to you about it is a lot of people I know that really hate woke and are sort of either centrist or liberal but don't like PC culture, or they're libertarian or conservative. They really will, join you up in arms about how feminism is saying ridiculously ludicrous things, blah, blah, blah. But they won't go to men's rights activism because they just think that's like feminism for men.
Uh-huh.
What do you say to that?
Yeah. So there are a couple of things to say. For a start, I mean, a lot of those people will suggest that feminism was at some point in history, at least partially, and at least partially they'll be right, legitimate, because women were disadvantaged as compared to men.
Right.
I think it's fair to say, I know it's fair to say, I believe it with all my heart, that at this point in time, men are disadvantaged as compared to women in our society. And so that makes advocating on men's behalf and on behalf of boys a legitimate course of action. I would also suggest that we as men's human rights advocates fundamentally unable to be like feminists, in that human beings are innately gynocentric and very sensitive to the welfare and the needs and the wants and the experiences of women and girls. And so were we to try with all of our might to manipulate society for the advantage of men and boys in the way that feminists have and continue to for women and girls, it just would not work. It's not possible. There is an empathy gap that prevents that happening.
What would you say to people who say men's rights is identity politics, and the whole point of opposing feminism is to get out of identity politics and to talk about people as individuals and not worry about who's more advantaged or less advantaged?
Yeah, I think that is an absolutely valid point. Absolutely. And it is something that it should be of concern to us as a community. And I think it is of concern to us as a community. And I think it is easy in today's world to get caught up in identity politics. And I know, less so, not for ages, but I have caught myself in the past falling down a rabbit hole that's like an Anita Sarkeesian style. Everything is misandry, kind of, because, like when she said everything is problematic when she got into feminism, because once you start to see these things that you have never seen before, because you've been socially conditioned and because we are biologically kind of not determined, but persuaded to be quite unaware of the experiences of men and boys. When you suddenly start seeing all these things, it can be almost addictive, and there is a sort of very new member of the men's human rights movement or no, I'm not going to generalize like that. I would say that I felt when this world opened up to me, that there was some kind of status afforded to people who were the first to spot disadvantages to men and boys, and examples of misandry in society. I would say that I felt like that, and that I was too highly strung, uptight, and identitarian. But the community polices that, and there are, the veteran members of the movement and the figureheads are not sensitive snowflakes. We're all pretty tough. And I don't think that it's fair to say that if you repeatedly point out ways in which a certain demographic is legitimately, systematically disadvantaged within your society, that makes you an identitarian who can be dismissed. But I would say that is something I have personally, that's an area in which I have personally grown. I would say that 5 years ago, it would be justifiable to have called me an identitarian. I don't think that's the case now, because I've grown up and I don't care about status like I did. I care about the truth. And I find that I can derive a lot more meaning from life and my relationships by aiming for the truth rather than status.
Yeah, well, it shows you have integrity, obviously.
Thank you.
If you can admit that about yourself, it's not easy to say, I was an identitarian, even about the movement I still agree with and support today. It's a very kind of a brave expression of humility to say that.
Thank you. I've not admitted that before. That's exclusive.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I always admire in people, is when people can say, I made a mistake. I was a feminist for 15 years, and I consider that a huge mistake on my part. I feel guilty about my feminist vlogs. So I'm in the same boat as you. I'm not perfect either.
Well, I have post-feminist guilt too. No, I tell a lie. I was a feminist, sorry. I don't feel guilty about it. I suppose I do feel a little bit guilty about not being as wise and reasonable as would be appropriate when I first started advocating for men and boys, because I would like to be a good, convincing advocate for men and boys. Although, I think there was something else I was going to mention about the identitarianism, and that was that part of my development has been to stop identifying as a men's rights advocate. So
have I mistakenly mislabeled you then in calling you a men's rights activist?
Well, no, because I do not deny the label, because it's what I practically do most of my time while I am advocating. But if you ask me how I identify, I will tell you that I'm an anti-feminist gender equality activist, because I don't have any special feeling for men and boys as compared to women and girls. And I do acknowledge that both elsewhere in the world, as well as here in the UK, there are issues affecting women and girls that need to be addressed. And every so often I dip my toe into the waters and talk about those issues. And indeed, because issues, we are all swimming in the same pond. And so while there are issues that are directly affecting men and boys, those men and boys are intimately connected to a whole web of women and girls. So, every time I advocate for justice for men and boys, that is advocacy for justice for all the women who love them. I see the men's human rights movement as a progressive movement, and I think that it's one of the wonders of the modern world that women have been liberated like we have. I think that really I think that men need to be sort of similarly liberated, and I do think that, for example, so as a libertarian in particular, I'm a libertarian with a slightly small L.
Are you a no benefits to anybody ever libertarian?
No, I'm not. But there's a but. That is more because I am a pragmatist and I am a British citizen, and I love Britain, and I know that the welfare state is important on an emotional level to the vast majority of my fellow citizens. So it's not necessarily that I think it's the most efficient, effective way to ensure that people are all right and that people don't starve and that they have a roof over their heads and that they can get through hard times and come out stronger. That's not entirely clear to me, but if it's important to the rest of my citizens, I wouldn't want to exert my will on the populace. It's a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
That's democracy.
Yeah.
So, however, I do think that there are ways in which the system that we have, which includes like the welfare state and family justice, and also the pervasive, ubiquitous kind of misandry, which is coupled with a pervasive, ubiquitous kind of deification of women, which like the two things together, like either one is kind of problematic. But when you put the misandry together with the just ridiculous deification of women, it's like they can't coexist comfortably. They cause friction.
Mm-hmm.
So when you have all that together, women struggle to make decisions that are good for themselves and their families. I think that, for example, the divorce rate, 70% of divorces are initiated by women. Now, I don't have a problem with the divorce rate in total. I understand that not every relationship is going to work, but I don't believe that men are inherently worse partners than women. I think that, if the divorce rate was as it was, which I've been told, I'm not 100% sure, but I have been told that the divorce rate in total is similar in our society and, the US to what you see in hunter-gatherer societies. So I think it's a fairly natural level. That could be completely wrong, but, certainly the UK and the US are kind of interesting comparisons because we have slightly different laws and we blame the laws that we have, and yet we have like the same divorce rate. But I think that there are women who are leaving relationships arbitrarily, and that there are probably men who are not leaving relationships because they understand that if they do, the system is very much stacked against them and may punish them unjustly for, escaping an unhealthy situation. My point, which is coming back to your question, is that, there is a difference in definitions of equality that you will find from members of the men's human rights movement and feminists. So feminists, in a nutshell, tend to focus on equality of outcome, whereas we focus on equality of opportunity. And they are the more powerful lobbying group. And so there are many initiatives and policies and even, legislation that is designed to equalize outcomes. And I think that actually, if our policies and legislation and initiatives were all designed to equalize the opportunity, we would see somewhat greater disparities in outcome. I mean, like Joanna Williams points out in Women versus Feminism, the differences in disparities that we see in like the top levels of the professional world are naturally going to reduce because, even half a century ago, there was discrimination against women in education, and there were societal expectations that women would pursue family first. And so, that's no longer there. And if you look at professions like law, there are far more women going in at the bottom level, and so they are going to filter up. However, there is also research by Catherine Hakim on preference theory, and she found that 7 in 10 men are work-focused, I think, as compared to like 4 in 10 women or something like that. And in The Sexual Paradox by Susan Pinker, she interviews like a string of women who were super successful and then they had kids, and they either chose to scale back their work or to leave work entirely. I do think that a lot of women, I wouldn't go so far as to say majority, but I would say that more women than men have that as a preference, which is fine. And it's also fine if they do want to pursue their careers, and it's fine if men want to pursue being a stay-at-home dad or their careers, whatever is all good. But I don't foresee a state of affairs wherein people freely choose, men and women freely choose their occupations, and the outcomes are equal. And obviously you have the Norwegian gender equality paradox, where they've pumped resources into equalizing outcomes, and yet they have some of the greatest sort of disparities in terms of sex segregated occupations in the world. Whereas I believe that one of the most gender equal nations in terms of which occupations the sexes go into is actually Iran.
That's interesting.
Because they don't have the welfare state that we have, and they don't privilege women after separation. So women choose to go into fields that are lucrative.
Is your view that Iran does not oppress women and is actually good for men?
My view of Iran is, Iran breaks my heart. It's a horribly oppressive regime. And I actually have a bit of a hobby, which is going onto search engines and looking for pictures of Iran in the 60s.
Right.
Because the people all look so free and happy, and it just looks beautiful. And now it's horrendous, and the kind of bad hijab laws and punishments for bad hijab are just horrendous. And it's very much being enforced without popular consent, as far as I can see. I certainly, I don't think that Iranian men are in favor of the way their women are limited. And you can see that quite clearly there was a beautiful hashtag campaign with Iranian men wearing hijabs in protest at the fact that their sisters and wives and daughters had to, which was incredibly simple and sweet. And a lot of the pictures were particularly sweet because they would be, in the house smiling with their wives next to them, and it was all very funny. But there was it was very brave because they were risking their own liberty and safety by doing that.
So it seems then that your kind of position on gender is not simply a return to the past of gender roles.
No, indeed it's not. I mean, where I very much differ from feminists is that I don't see historic gender roles as an attempt by men to limit and oppress women. I see them as a necessary response to biological realities and a very sensible division of labour. And Jordan Peterson put it very beautifully. He said that the patriarchy was an imperfect response by our ancestors to escape or to rescue each other from privation, disease and drudgery, or something like that. And I have an awful lot of gratitude for the men and women who were limited and disadvantaged, because both men and women were limited and disadvantaged traditionally by, their sex. And I have a lot of sympathy for, I believe it was in 2018, to coincide with the centenary of the Representation of the People Act 1918, a book was published called Things a Bright Girl Can Do. And it was a story about a bright girl in 1918 who was limited because, well, no, it would have been prior to 1918. It was set actually because it was before women got the vote that the book was set. But she was limited in that she was barred from entering some forms of education and was expected to get married and run a household. And I can empathize with that because I wouldn't want to be in that situation. I would want to have choices. But what it failed to appreciate was the fact that, you know, while this character as a wealthy young woman was limited by her sex, a wealthy young man back then, whilst he had choices in terms of, you know, education and employment, he was also subject to the draft. And actually, a wealthy young man who had been well educated would have potentially been part of the officer class who were had a 5% higher death rate even than ordinary soldiers. So the sort of inference in the book that women were disadvantaged as compared to men historically, I don't think is fair. I think that both men and women had serious disadvantages, you know, and actually, I think that the real inequality, if you're looking back 100 years, was very much class-based. You know, this woman couldn't go to university. Well, neither could the vast majority of men. This woman couldn't vote. Well, neither could the vast majority of men. Prior to 1918, anyway, when I say 100 years ago. And I think that we should have an awful lot of gratitude for the fact that our ancestors accepted their sex-based limitations and worked hand in hand to build the foundations of what we have today, in which we're the most fortunate human beings to ever have lived and the most free.
Because of this sort of wanting clarity on your part on where the men's human rights movement stands, you've written a piece called "The Men's Human Rights Movement is a Tradcon Trojan Horse."
Yeah.
Would you mind saying a bit to our listeners about, first of all, what is Tradcon in this context, and what did you mean by Trojan horse?
Certainly. So, in this context, Tradcon is referring to, when I say Tradcon, I mean people who believe in that traditional sex roles should be in some way enforced, and that traditional sex roles are more functional as a rule, and that the enforcement of some kind of traditional, sex roles is preferable to letting people choose freely how they want to organize their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say Trojan horse, I'm referring to an assumption that is made. And actually, I think I might have been referring to something in particular. So yeah, I think it was the Hope Not Hate report, the 2019 State of Hate report by Hope Not Hate claimed that improvements in gender equality in recent years and the feminist campaigns propelling them forward have been met by resistance and opposition in parts of society. And they claimed that what we do is to use a human rights framework to push for the revocation of women's liberties.
Okay, and you obviously took issue with that, which is why you wrote this piece. So
I did.
You said in this piece, quote, "However, in my opinion, we are an inherently progressive movement who want to build on the liberal values that our societies have evolved. We seek an end to gynocentric legislation / administration of law and the extension of the rights, opportunities, choices, and consideration that women and girls receive for men and boys." Unquote. Would you mind telling our listeners what is gynocentrism here, and what are some examples of this?
So, gynocentrism is the prioritization of the needs and preferences of women and girls as compared to men and boys. And the evolutionary psychology theory goes that we do that instinctively as human beings because women are the limiting factor in reproduction.
Right.
So women are able to have like a baby a year if they're lucky, and whereas men can impregnate like an infinite number of women if they try really hard. And so if you are living in a tribe in prehistoric times and you lose all but one woman, your tribe is not going to survive. Whereas if by some unfortunate circumstance you lose all but one man, you're going to struggle, but you have a better chance of survival. So human beings instinctively want to protect women. This instinct has been manipulated and weaponized by feminists. And that goes from I put the sort of date of the quickening back to the late Middle Ages, when various feminist historians point to the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine as being that they're proto-feminists, according to feminist historians, and I'll take their word for it. And what Eleanor of Aquitaine and her court did in the late Middle Ages was very interesting. So they subverted chivalric codes, which used to govern the relationship or the relationships between knights and lords and religious authorities and also citizens. But obviously that, when people hear the word chivalry, those relationships are not what people think of now. And that's because Eleanor of Aquitaine and her court subverted the idea of chivalry to pertain not to knights and their relationships with authorities and the people they served, but to pertain to men and women. And their justifications for this were things like they capitalized on the worst behaviors of the worst men towards women and generalized that this was a natural state of affairs and therefore women needed specific protection from men. And they had a lot of ideas about female moral superiority, and therefore women should be in that position of explicit moral authority and men should serve women. And it's all very familiar. That's gynocentrism, which has kind of exponentially grown since the late Middle Ages, I would say.
So you've said that this is, at least evolutionary psychologists will say that this is caused by some innate tendency in human beings that we've inherited through time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with the psychologists about that? Do you think that's true?
I think that there is that instinct in human beings, yes. And I think that it will continue. I think that in life and death situations, where you find men and women fighting for their lives, or, you know, or with their lives at risk, it's always going to be far more likely that he will throw himself over her as a human shield, for example. I think that there are instinctive roles that people play in like life and death situations. However, I think that when there are situations wherein we don't have to make instinctive decisions, like, for example, when we are devising policies and writing legislation, we can be better than that. We can... Sorry, I mean, that was a really horrible thing to say. When men in particular show extraordinary bravery, you know, that's a beautiful thing. So I don't mean to say we're better than that, but I mean we can make more egalitarian decisions when we have time. We can engage our rational brains instead of our lizard brains, and we can consciously try to create situations wherein men and women have equal rights, opportunities, and choices.
So is your view then, in the 21st century, women and men have the same rights, but women have too many privileges, and that's fundamentally what your opposition to gynocentrism amounts to?
I mean, it's possibly being slightly pedantic, but I would say that I don't have an opposition to gynocentrism, in that it depends on your definition. I think that there are rights that men and boys lack, and some of them are in practice and some of them are actually on paper. So, for example, we have the Equality Act in the UK, which prevents discrimination based on certain protected characteristics, one of which is sex.
Right.
So my position is that in the 21st century, if you look at the UK specifically, men and boys lack rights as compared to women and girls, and rights that are fundamental human rights, usually in practice.
Okay.
Occasionally on paper. So, for example, we have the Equality Act, which prevents or prohibits discrimination based on various protected characteristics. Yeah, so if you go sort of chronologically through the lifetime of a man, it begins in the UK, as in many places in the world, with baby boys specifically not being protected from genital mutilation.
Okay.
And then as you move through school, you find that boys are treated unfavorably as compared to girls in school, and that in school, increasingly over someone's career in education, you know, there are positive discrimination for girls. Positive discrimination in favor of one group necessitates straight old discrimination against any outside group. And obviously, you know, in universities, that's like a fever pitch. There are so many informal and formal resources and initiatives for women, and that there just aren't for men. And then there's positive discrimination in the workplace for women, which means just discrimination against men. Discrimination against men in family courts and in criminal courts. And there is a huge disparity between the funding that's available for the research into and treatment for female diseases as compared to male diseases within healthcare systems. And then there's also a lack of funding and support available for male victims of crime. And in the UK, our written legislation is actually pretty good. I mean, there are things like the Istanbul Convention, which write patriarchy theory into law by suggesting that interpersonal violence is a form of oppression against women based on historical disparities or something like that. But generally speaking, UK legislation is gender neutral and doesn't need to change. I mean, when we brought in legislation against female genital mutilation a few years back, for example, there were people who pointed out that female genital mutilation is not legal. It wasn't legal then. It was already prohibited by the Offences Against the Person Act 1861. But, you know, from a strict reading of the Offences Against the Person Act 1861, so's male genital mutilation. It's not that our laws need to change so much as the way they're enacted. So, for example, I mean, I remember having an argument with a feminist a few years back, and I was saying, you know, the Equality Act is gender neutral and it prohibits discrimination based on sex. So therefore, positive discrimination for women is not lawful. And the feminists' response was that, well, where's your case law? There has not been any, or there are not any examples of the Equality Act being ruled to apply to men, which was true at the time. But actually now the Equality Act has been used to defend men against discrimination in some kind of not altogether significant. Well, not they were significant, but they were quite. There was a case where a man had sought to buy a discounted beer. I believe it was actually on International Women's Day, and it was there was an offer on wherein women didn't have to pay so much.
Right.
And he had taken like a brewery or a pub or something to court saying it was discriminating against him as a man, and he won his case. But there have also been cases that have been won wherein men were discriminated against in employment, and so in shortlists, like, and actually it was actually ruled that all women shortlists for members of parliament were discriminatory and unlawful. But there was then which government was it? I think it might have been David Cameron's government kind of brought in further legislation to make all women shortlists legal, and for like 20 years or something.
Interesting. What would you say to somebody who says that all of those things that you've described, those rights that men don't have, that the reason those things exist the way they do is because men are happy to give women those rights because women are weaker, and men naturally, maybe even biologically, want to put women before themselves in those ways?
Yeah, well, that would be a tradcon position. And I think that they are not entirely wrong. I think that men are often happy to prioritize women's needs and wants. I just don't think that that should be the basis of our legal system or our employment system. I think that should be something for personal, private relationships.
Interesting. So, do you think in the name of fairness, we should try to at least legally transcend our biological predispositions?
Yeah, and I mean, for example, there was a really interesting Ministry of Justice report. It's fairly old now. It's probably about 2015 or something like that. And one of the things they looked at was the disparity in the rates of prisoner by sex. And this Ministry of Justice report actually explicitly said that one of the reasons that men are more likely to go to prison than women, and when they were sentenced to prison, more likely to serve longer sentences for similar crimes with similar histories, was because men are more likely to have aggravating factors added to their sentences, like lack of appearance of remorse and affiliation with gangs. And women were more likely to have mitigating factors detracted from their sentences, like the appearance of genuine remorse and like motherhood, which sort of begs the question, who did they have these children with? Because, I'm yet to see a man's sentence reduced because he has responsibilities to look after his children.
Do you think women are forced to conform to feminist opinions?
I think that there is pressure for women to conform to feminist opinions. There is a lack of honesty about what choosing to live your life as a woman in accordance with feminist opinions means. And when I say that, I'm thinking of like a conversation I had. It was a sort of debate with a feminist who's also called Elizabeth Holden.
Yes, she and her boyfriend William Costello are friends of mine. They both speak very highly of you.
I love them both dearly. They're both absolutely wonderful, and it's a really lovely little curiosity that a men's rights advocate, if I hope you wouldn't mind me calling him that, and a feminist, or certainly a feminist and an active non-feminist, I think that would certainly be fair, can love each other and live in harmony. That's nice. But one of the things she said when she and I were debating, she was advocating for women to choose to pursue professional careers when they're young. And she said, because, something along the lines that now, with all of our scientific advances, women can just have a baby when they're 40. And I had to stop her and say, I can't let that stand on record, because as a mother, I know a lot of other mothers who have decided to have children later in life. And it's potentially a very difficult, expensive, traumatic experience to go through. It's not easy to get pregnant or to give birth as an older woman. And there is a taboo around being honest about that because of feminist pressure. And I think that there's a taboo about being honest with young women, that actually they do put themselves at a significant biological disadvantage if they decide that they're going to pursue careers, throughout their 20s and 30s, and then they can, do the family thing. And it's absolutely a perfectly valid decision to do that. But I don't think it's fair that we don't tell women that it might be more difficult.
Okay. Do you think there's also something in women where women want to be able to do whatever they want to do without making any sacrifices whatsoever? And that might be part of what's motivating this taboo against saying, hey, wait a minute, if you want to have a kid, you probably should have it earlier?
Yeah. I think that's absolutely true. And if there was some kind of, I would say that the way we respond to men and women is very much polarized.
Right.
And so men are very much subject to criticism, whatever they do. In so many cases, men are damned if they do and damned if they don't. And I don't think that's useful. I think there does need to be, or in a healthy society, there would be some element of celebration of masculinity and acceptance of masculinity. But on the other hand, I think that women are celebrated and accepted and never criticized. And I think that that's just as dysfunctional as the way we treat men. And so, while men have this extraordinarily narrow pathway to walk down in order to be acceptable members of society, women have got no guidance at all. Nobody says, that suggests any way in which women can succeed as or exist in a way that is socially useful. It is, and even to the extent where it's like, oh no, we must ban the word bossy because that's sexist. And it's like, perhaps it's true, and perhaps it's useful, and perhaps bossy women should be, called out in the same way that a man who was domineering would be called out.
Interesting.
So I think that both, the way we respond to men and women's choices, I think, is equally unhealthy, and we need to bring it to a middle ground where we are being fair and giving people some kind of guidance in the way of serving judgment on them when they mess up, but also accepting who they intrinsically are and acknowledging their intrinsic value as human beings. Women who choose not to have children at all, that's a perfectly valid choice. And there are very few ways in which their biology limits them, unless their ambition is to win, a marathon and be ahead of all the men.
Yeah, that's interesting. So one of the things you wrote in that same paragraph, which is interesting, is you said that mockery of feminism can result in deplatforming, and innocent behavior on the part of men, if unwelcome, is referred to as entitled, on a continuum with rape and potentially a hate crime. Now, this is a really difficult thing to think about because it seems in this day and age that it's kind of, by the logic of polite society anyway, just kind of obvious that unwanted behavior of a sexual nature from men fits the definition of sexual harassment, and there's no ambiguity about whether society is against sexual harassment of women. Is that not the case?
So I believe that a moral definition of harassment far exceeds some of the behaviours which may legally be defined as harassment. And so I think that, harassment should be a consistent pattern of behaviours that are intentionally designed to distress someone or denigrate them. And yet, there was a homeless guy in Scotland who was convicted of sexual harassment for gazing wistfully at a girl in a shop once. And I think that that's morally outrageous. And I think it's a really sad direction for us to go in. I understand that some women are more sensitive than others, and a man gazing wistfully at them or a man complimenting them out of the blue when they don't even know him, or perhaps wolf whistling at her, may distress some women. And I would say that it is the responsibility of any movement that purports to liberate women to build strong women who can police their own boundaries rather than feeling traumatized at every tiny little thing and reaching for the authority of the state.
Do you think that we have a responsibility to tell overly sensitive women, you can't call anything you don't like sexual harassment? It has to be a persistent pattern. If you're reacting negatively because somebody stared at you wistfully and calling the police or trying to punish that person in some way, actually the problem is with you. Would you be happy to say that?
I would alter it somewhat. I mean, for free speech's sake, she can call it whatever she wants.
Okay.
I just don't think that she should have legal recourse to punish someone. But I think that it is incumbent upon an enlightened society to try to encourage strength in people. Yeah. Both men and women, I think that there is an injustice in punishing people who have really done nothing wrong. I think that there is a disservice done to people who are offended by little things when you, instead of encouraging them to grow from that experience and to realize that the power is in them, control how people behave in relation to them. It's like the girl in the shop could have gone outside and said, I don't like you staring at me. And had the homeless man then said, well, I don't give a shit, I'm going to carry on staring at you, I would say that's some kind of violation, and perhaps, we need to escalate what's happening. It's the fact that you go from 0 to 100 miles an hour on the consequence train that is not useful. And it also, it's infantilizing to women and it's weakening to women. And I would feel the same, regardless of sex.
Okay.
I think that.
So,
and also one last thing is that it's just terribly sad because when people are attracted to each other, there's there's a whole myriad of things that can transpire from that. So, you know, one of them is that it can be very awkward and embarrassing for everyone involved, or it can be very tragic if, you know, someone's very lovelorn and the other person's scornful, or it can be fun, or it can even be beautiful and meaningful. And the more that men are given reason to fear expressing attraction, expressing tragic, fun, and meaningful experiences we're all going to be exposed to, which robs the colour from our lives.
What would you say to a woman who says, I want to feel comfortable and I don't care about these colorful experiences? If I have to live in a world where nobody can touch me in order for me to feel comfortable, that's the world I want to live in.
I mean, I'm put in mind of our earlier exchange about the welfare state when I said, you know, it's not entirely clear to me that it's most efficient and it's most efficient to organise our society like that, but it's important to other people. And so I think that it's egocentric. It would be egocentric for a woman to prioritise her own comfort over meaning in the lives of every other woman. I think that we should strive to build strong and vital people having really meaningful experiences rather than diluting and prohibiting everyone's meaning to make the weakest feel comfortable. And I also just think that it's, you know, it's personal responsibility to ensure comfort. And it would be ridiculous, I think, to assume that one is always going to be comfortable. But I think that we do have power to make many of our situations and environments quite comfortable. Like, you know, I'm brought to mind the experience of Richard Ned Liebau, who was at a conference, some kind of academic thing. I forget what it was now, but he got into a lift. You might have heard the story, and a feminist academic asked him what floor he was going to, and he said ladies' lingerie. And in that situation, she felt offended, and she had the power there and then. They weren't the only people in the lift to say, I don't find that funny, and I think you should apologise for that distasteful remark that was absolutely inappropriate in the setting. But she didn't. She said nothing, and then she appealed to the authority of whoever the conference organisers were and got him thrown out of the organisation.
Well, this is difficult because, I mean, on the one hand, that seems like very sort of prissy, princessy behavior to me. But if that is sort of like her etiquette about what is acceptable and unacceptable, that the entire college probably agrees with, and polite society agrees with today, it does feel like the problem is that we have a corrupted etiquette about what's acceptable and unacceptable. It might not be that people are being too harsh about the etiquette. It might be that the etiquette itself is wrong.
So do you mean define the etiquette that's wrong for me?
Well, there seems to be this assumption that if you are going to respect women, you can't in any way joke about your or celebrate your sexuality.
Yeah.
Whereas women can say whatever they want to joke about and celebrate their own sexuality in relation to you. And if that same feminist, let's say, said a joke about men that she thought were attractive or a part of the man's body, it would be misogynist for him to say that makes me feel uncomfortable. So the question is, do you think the entire etiquette just is wrong?
So, I do think that the entire etiquette's wrong. Do you remember when Jeremy Corbyn was attending PMQs with Theresa May, and she was responding to him, and he sat down and muttered, "Bloody woman,"
Yes.
quite clearly. And everyone went nuts. And it was like, had he sat down muttering "bloody man" about any of the men in there would have been no problem. Had he said, "What a wonderful woman," there would be no problem. So it's neither the disrespect or criticism that was a problem, and it wasn't the fact that her sex was mentioned that was a problem. It was the fact that there was criticism and sex within the same muttered breath, and the sex was specifically female. That was a problem. Like, etiquette should be consistent, and we should show similar levels of respect for individuals regardless of their sex. But also, I think that we really should expect people to take personal responsibility when they feel offended, and that they should be encouraged to police their own boundaries, because that would make them internally stronger. It would give them more self-respect as a byproduct, and it would prevent gross injustices and overreactions.
So one of the things that you also mentioned in that paragraph above is you talked about how men are referred to as entitled, where the suggestion is that they're sexually entitled. They feel like they have a right to have sex with women, and that's absolutely horrible and something we need to sort of erase from the culture. Do you think that men feel entitled to have sex with women?
I have this really weird idea that we, as men and women, are more the same than different. And I kind of have this idea that when most fairly normal men approach a woman with romantic interest, they probably go through mixes of emotion. Like, people approach the person who is doing the approaching does not feel in a position of power. I think most of us feel fairly vulnerable in that position. And like, the other person who has the opportunity to accept or reject us has more power than we do.
That's very interesting. So do you think it's unfair, for instance, that certain men feel that if they go on a date with a woman and if they're charming and if they pay for the date, that they should be able to expect sex at the end of the date? Is that a horrible form of entitlement that culture needs to erase?
If a man felt, or a woman for that matter, that they were entitled to sex because they paid for a date, I would think that that was quite gross. On the other hand, if a man or woman thought that it was acceptable to lead someone on and give the impression that they were sexually available when they absolutely weren't, in order to encourage the other individual to pay for a date, I'd also think that was quite gross.
So the next question then is related to sex, and that's in another part of your piece. You write a lot about the men's human rights movement's response to Me Too.
Yeah.
And one of the paragraphs you write is, the men's human rights movement is absolutely committed to the principles of innocent till proven guilty and blind justice. In recent decades, feminists have successfully promoted the idea of believing the victim in cases of alleged violence, harassment, or sexual misconduct against women, regardless of available evidence. This has led to kangaroo courts and universities weighing evidence on a probability basis, 51% likely, miscarriages of justice, and even deaths, unquote. So one thing I wanted to ask you about this is, what would you say to somebody who says, if we didn't believe women, this would create unnecessary obstacles towards women successfully prosecuting highly successful men who sexually abuse women, men like Harvey Weinstein. What would you say to that woman?
Well, I think that there are appropriate places to believe the victim, such as helplines and, domestic abuse helplines, by and large, ones that cater to women will believe the victim. And I think that's absolutely appropriate because it can be very difficult to share experiences of abuse, and a helpline can be the first port of call. However, courts of law really have to be based on innocent till proven guilty, as should courts of public opinion, as far as I'm concerned. I am not entirely convinced that all of the convictions for sexual harassment and abuse that have been going down in the last few years, from the whole U-Tree thing over here with Jimmy Savile and Rolf Harris, to Harvey Weinstein, meet a legal standard that is appropriate for a free and liberal society.
What would you say to a woman who says that when a woman accuses a man of being a sexual predator, because the accusation is so serious, it's highly unlikely she would be lying? The odds are that she's telling the truth, so if any celebrity or group of celebrities who are female accuse a male of sexual misconduct, you should probably just give them the benefit of the doubt and assume it's true. What would you say to that?
I would suggest that women are as human as anyone, and human beings lie. And not only do human beings lie, sometimes we just do. In fact, quite often, I believe, to varying degrees. But that in modern Western societies, there are increasing perverse incentives to lie, from the kind of compensation that was awarded to people who accused the deceased Jimmy Savile of inappropriate conduct, to the kind of status of martyrdom that is bestowed upon these brave survivors in our victimhood culture.
Say to this objection: if there is a serial sexual predator in the movie industry, how else can women come forward and make sure he no longer abuses them, except to tell their stories to the media with bravery? Isn't that how other women will come forward and corroborate the evidence?
If there is a serious sexual predator in Hollywood, I think that the criminal justice system is quite capable of dealing with that situation. And actually, I think that, with the Me Too movement, while I'm broadly against it, I don't think that I acknowledge that there are some serious stories that women needed to tell, and I think that the problem with the Me Too movement, while that may be a partially true narrative about it, is that alongside legitimate experiences, there were it also provided an opportunity as well as a series of incentives to lie or to even exaggerate or to become deluded that experiences that were actually quite, consensual. It's like the morning after kind of feeling.
Well, those are all the questions I had for the piece you did on the Trojan horse. One of the interesting things about the previous piece that we've just talked about is it went into things that you've thought about female sexuality. And a recent piece that you've just shown me that you haven't published, which I believe is called The Limited Virtue of Beauty, I found quite fascinating because this is sort of a piece that you've written that isn't specifically about men's rights, but it really is about feminine sexuality and females really in their relationship to beauty. So I wanted to ask you...
It really isn't about men's rights.
I know. So I wanted to ask you, what was sort of the inspiration for this piece?
Well, I started writing for a site called Woke Father, probably 2 months ago. And the writers and the editors there have a little forum, and we post ideas for articles, and then whoever's interested in writing to that subject siphons off the articles they want to cover, and it's quite a fun space. And someone had posted a suggestion for an article which was about the disparity between the amount of attention that a Kardashian gets in comparison with a woman like Alyssa Carson, who's a really, really bloody cool young lady who recently became the youngest person in history to complete all of the NASA tests. She was 19 at the time. And the suggestion in the kind of explanation of what this article would be about, which it wasn't called the limited virtue of beauty at the time, it was called something else that I forget. But my initial response was like, I think female beauty is really important. And so that was my initial inspiration. And then, as you know, because you've read it, I go on to qualify the importance of female beauty, because it's not the only virtue. But, my initial inspiration was to defend feminine beauty.
And then it became...
because it gives me joy.
And then it became more qualified as it went on?
Well, I do think, that there's a nuance, and I think that the person who suggested it had a point, because it's criminal how little celebration there was about Alyssa Carson and how few people know about her. I mean, her Twitter following is so far below what it should be, because she's cool as fuck. Whereas, when you compare it to kind of I find the Kardashians fairly banal, and it's not the kind of that their manufactured kind of beauty is not the kind of beauty that inspires me personally. I don't really get it, but everybody's free to enjoy what they enjoy. But I do think that it's a little sad that we aren't more awestruck by women like Alyssa, who actually I find significantly more beautiful than any of the Kardashians, which is beside the point.
Yeah.
But, you know, for her intense and awesome intelligence and motivation and drive and bravery, because this is a 19-year-old girl who's made her mind up that she wants to be one of the early settlers on Mars. And how cool is that? And it's like, I would like to live in a society that pays attention to something like that. I mean, if she was a man, I'd think we should pay attention to her. But this was specifically about women. And I think that as well, while there is a reactionary tendency to demean feminine beauty, which is, you know, I'd say it was a sort of minority, but I think it happens and it's noticeable. I think that's probably a response to the fact that too many people accept feminine beauty as being a sort of be all and end all, fix all kind of virtue, which is simply not true, and not even for a beautiful woman. Women certainly can't have the kind of fertile signatures along with the symmetry and physical beauty that is likely to inspire men to provide for them whatever they need and want forever.
Okay.
Although, you know, I mean, there are plenty of older women who are beautiful, but I'm quite into the passage from The Twits by Roald Dahl, where he essentially says that you can be as kind of physically perfect as you like, but if you have nasty thoughts, they'll shine out of you and you'll become increasingly unattractive. Whereas you can be, you know, have a crooked nose and wonky teeth and whatever, but if you have good thoughts, they'll shine out of you and you'll be attractive.
So one passage of your piece goes like this: feminine beauty, as varied and ephemeral as the flower, is a delightful part of the human world that is denigrated usually through scorn or ignorance. Denigrated most usually through scorn or ignorance.
Oh, is that a typo?
Yeah, so maybe I should erase that. I'll say the passage again. So I'll read it again. Sorry.
Yeah, take out the first through. I'll keep the second one.
Okay. Feminine beauty, as varied and ephemeral as the flower, is a delightful part of the human world that is denigrated most usually through scorn or ignorance. The beautiful woman spreads joy and fascination and has the power to bring men sometimes to their most base and more often to their best. Unquote. What would you think be an example of scorn and ignorance in this context?
I suppose the first thing that springs to mind is the feminist denigration and criticism of glamour models.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm thinking specifically of when they kicked up such a fuss that Formula One dropped their grid girls and the darts dropped their walk-on girls, you know, and these feminists, you know, who took to daytime TV to support the decisions to drop these girls or women. They were women, but they were generally referred to as girls during this conversation. They saw no value in, you know, they called the women decorative, like that was not valuable.
So do you think it is valuable for women to be like erotic furniture?
Erotic furniture. Yeah. I've thought about it, and I'm going to say, yeah. My bedroom is like a shrine to beautiful women. And there are also some, heroic women framed in there, but lots of the women are there simply because they're lovely to look at. And it's like saying, in my opinion, that there is no value distinction to be made between a block of 1960s council flats and the Sistine Chapel. Beauty, whether it is a building or a woman, is, an ultimate value, in the words of Roger Scruton. It really brings the world to life, and it provides meaning.
Do you know something very strange, Elizabeth? I'm a heterosexual man. And I think intuitively I feel more like the feminist you're criticizing.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I feel guilty. I would feel guilty having a room with a bunch of beautiful women in it. Obviously I'm not going to do that because I'm married, but even if I was single, I'd feel guilty having a bunch of beautiful women in my room to look at.
Would you feel guilty if you were living in a 1960s council flat and then you got a bit more money and moved out to somewhere where there was a little more light and a little bit more attention paid to aesthetics rather than basic function?
No, but I don't see the
connection.
I don't see the aesthetics of nature or buildings as being like the aesthetics of women.
Of human beings.
Because the most horrible human beings I have ever met in my life happened to be beautiful women when I was younger. Most of the most abusive teachers I ever had or knew of that I didn't have were beautiful women who got away with it because they were beautiful. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is some of the most amazing women I've ever known were not beautiful, or at least I wasn't attracted to them. And then I think of beautiful women who I had crushes on as a kid, and when they became older women who lost their beauty, I didn't find them very interesting apart from the beauty. It wasn't like I was still interested in them when I heard them speak without their beauty when they were older. It seemed like the fascination I had with them was really the fascination with the beauty. It wasn't with who they were as individuals. And when I think of all those things simultaneously, the kind of message that I get in my brain, at least, is, well, beauty is shallow, and it's not about who you are, and it's not a good thing to praise because it's something your body does to you. It's not something that really expresses your agency. I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying.
Yeah.
I'm saying
no, it's interesting. Yeah.
I'm saying my feeling about beauty as a man, as a heterosexual man, is one of mostly guilt. And a feeling like this is shallow. I mean, it feels good, but it's like it feels good, but it's shallow. And I'm obviously attracted to my wife, so that's not a problem. And I think she's beautiful, and she always remains beautiful to me, no matter how old she is. And she doesn't really age very much, so she always kind of looks the same age anyway. But just the idea of like celebrating the fact that I find certain females really attractive and looking at them gives me pleasure. The idea of doing that fills me with guilt. Is that wrong?
I don't know if it's wrong. I wouldn't go that far. It's certainly, not something I would jump down your throat with. I find it unusual. It's not something I've considered before. It's not a perspective I've considered before. So I don't want to cast judgment on it. I take your point, absolutely. You made several points there. your feelings are not wrong. We all have preferences. I think it would be wrong for you to come into my bedroom and say, hey, you're wrong for enjoying these images.
Oh, I would never do that.
I know. But feminists see fit to deprive everybody else of Greek girls and walk-on girls.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a difficult one because I would never feel good about taking away anyone's right to look at those images. And I wouldn't, for instance, I mean, it's a kind of a weird thing because if you ever have an orgasm in your imagination, you're looking at those images anyway. So it's kind of like the question is, should you put stuff that gives you an orgasm in your imagination on your wall? And for me, the answer to that is, well, it's up to the individual, but I personally would feel a bit creeped out by doing that because I feel like my erotic imagination is inherently shallow in a way that I want my kind of walls not to be.
I mean, I suppose it's slightly different for me because if I'm, if there is a beautiful woman who is any part of one of my orgasms as a heterosexual woman, it's aspirational rather than,
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Oh, it doesn't bother me then if it's aspirational. Actually, if I had a bunch of men, I mean, I don't have any desire to look like beautiful men, but the idea of buying beautiful men and putting them on my walls does not in any way make me feel any guilt. But putting women that I'm attracted to on my walls does. And I don't know why that is.
Actually, now you've said that, I'm kind of getting where you're coming from. Because whilst I prefer heterosexual pornography with like one man and one woman, if I see his face or something, it puts me right off because I feel guilty.
Yeah. So it's not about valuing the aesthetic beauty necessarily. It's kind of showing off or being prideful of the fact that some kind of beauty turns you on.
I don't quite follow. Go on.
Say that
in different.
Like I said, I don't mind the idea of potentially, if say I wanted to be a bodybuilder and I had a bunch of beautiful men in my room that were aspirational, that wouldn't in any way make me feel guilty.
Yeah.
But if I put a bunch of pictures of women that I'm attracted to, who I could have orgasms looking at on my walls, that would make me feel guilty.
Yeah, and actually, I think I would feel the same about the idea of filling my walls with beautiful men, actually. Now you come to mention it. It's not occurred to me before. I've kind of thought of feminine beauty as something transcendent, but actually that's kind of easy to say as a straight woman.
Yeah. Well, see, this is difficult because as a heterosexual man, I live in a society that says that if I fancy women, it has to totally be on the woman's terms or else it's objectification and I'm degrading the woman. And I don't agree. I don't agree with that. I think that's a fundamentally like a sexist way of defining objectification as though it's synonymous with male sexuality and the male gaze. And I think that's not fair. But at the same time, it does seem to me that like sexuality generally, insofar as it's related to the visual appearance of people, it's really shallow. And it's understandable why people wouldn't like objectification in context other than sex. Because when you're not having an orgasm, you want to look at people as individuals. And when you're having an orgasm, even with your favorite person, even with your husband or wife or whoever, in that moment when you're having sex, you're thinking of them as this lovely piece of meat that gives you pleasure. And when you're not...
Yeah, I'm not convinced by that. Like, I have a difficulty with the phrase objectification because in my experience, the beauty of a human being, even when it's about their physicality, is intrinsically tied up with their humanity. And, if it wasn't, then why, is like, so why is pornography, why is almost all of it to people clearly or apparently enjoying their experience? I don't know many people who would feel aroused. I know it happens, but I don't know many people who would feel aroused by the idea of having sex with an unconscious person. But surely if we were, if objectification was as ubiquitous as we're led to believe, or, perhaps I'm defining it far too literally, I don't know. But what it says to me, you said a piece of meat.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a piece of meat is inanimate. Do you like to have sex with inanimate women?
Well, no, it's more like youth and beauty is like a beautiful meat suit that a woman wears until the suit falls off and becomes a not so beautiful meat suit.
Yeah, but
so if you obsess over the meat suit, there's something shallow about that.
Right. Yeah. Right. But I think that, well, I mean, I can only really, I am talking from my personal experience that for me, although it's not impossible to get a beautiful image, and there are a handful of women who I do not know past the images in my bedroom, only a handful. But generally speaking, it's quite difficult to be outwardly beautiful and without being at least sort of minimally inwardly beautiful. It's like...
Yeah, I don't know about that, Elizabeth.
Well, yeah, I mean, perhaps it is.
Let me put it to you this way. Have you ever had a crush on an old celebrity who was beautiful in the 60s?
And then my God.
And then you
like that's about 80% of my collection.
Okay. And then you see them now and they're not beautiful. And you think, okay, I was into them then, so when they open their mouth, I'm going to be interested now. And then they open their mouth and you think, oh my God, if it weren't for the fact that this person were beautiful 40 years ago, I wouldn't be interested. I wouldn't want to date this person. I wouldn't want to sleep with them. I think they were quite boring. And then you realize, oh my God, it wasn't really the person that I was into. It was what nature did to their body in the 60s.
Nah. I honestly can say that that's not generally my experience. And so, there's like Audrey Hepburn is in the collection, and she was physically gorgeous, but she had a grace that, was something that was cultivated, that was mesmerizing. And before she died, she was an old lady and she was wrinkled, but I still found her absolutely fascinatingly beautiful. And then I have Twiggy. I think she's still beautiful and valuable. Marianne Faithfull, she maintains her fascination for me. I maintain my fascination for her in her, mature state. And the pictures in my bedroom are them when they're young. I think that there is something, I think that there is a beauty in age, in particular when it's accompanied by wisdom and modesty and compassion and humility. But, I think there's also something about young people, particularly in photographs, that's really arresting, and that's cool. They can both be valuable.
Oh, certainly. I mean, I would never say that there are no older people that I find very beautiful. There obviously are. And there are some actresses who I think were beautiful back in the day when I was a kid, and they're still beautiful now, like Sherilyn Fenn. And I think she's really interesting and beautiful as Audrey Horne in 1990. And I think she's really interesting and beautiful now. But there's other people from that period that I'm like, whoa, they were so hot at that time. And I see them now and I'm like, whatever. And that kind of makes me think.
Give me an example.
Well, I don't want to, because I don't want to say nasty things about people on a podcast.
I know, it's mean, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's hard for me to get a grasp on. Can you why is it that you find them? Is it a personality thing? Is that what you're suggesting?
I think their personality was, back in the day, sexy. Now it is not, and neither is their body.
It's also obscure.
It's totally subjective. I mean, the same person I'm describing you might find sexy eternally, and that would be equally valid. But the fact that some people seem to be primarily interesting to me because of my youthful lust at their general appearance sort of makes me think, well, if that's a temporary expression of their physicality more than it is a kind of long-term fixation on who they are, then that makes me think that like the physicality is doing more work than it should and making me have a positive reaction to them. And really what should be doing most of the work is who they are, not what they look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that who someone is more important than what they look like, ultimately. I think it's much more stable. But I think that there is... I think that beauty is also important, and I do not judge, for example, women like a lot of people I feel judge effort into their appearance harshly. And I think that it's a lovely thing to do, as is putting, effort into surroundings and environment and work. I don't think that, the point of my article, my concession to the person who posted the suggestion, was that women should pay attention to things other than their physical appearance.
What's your problem?
I'm not really in the mood for this.
Well, fucking get in the mood.
I'm too uncomfortable.
Why?
I don't feel comfortable with you talking about me that way.
What way? I was trying to turn you on.
You're talking about me like I'm a child.
What does that even mean?
You're talking about me like I'm a kid who you're giving sex to in exchange for good behaviour.
That sounds like a naughty fantasy to me.
It might be as a fantasy, but right now it feels like it's not a fantasy. It feels like that's how you see me.
I see you as my boyfriend who I'm trying to do something nice for.
Something nice?
Yes, you're getting sex from your beautiful girlfriend who loves you.
Well, I don't know how I feel about that.
Would you rather I not be nice to you? Should I force you to take care of yourself in the other room?
I don't know. Sex isn't something I want because you want to be nice to me.
But I'm your girlfriend.
I don't want you to have sex with me because you want to be nice to me.
Joe, you're confusing me.
I want you to have sex with me because you want to.
But I do want to.
You want to so you can sleep.
No. I also think that you deserve some sex. I know it was hard for you today, hearing how I felt about your weight, and I thought I'd make it up to you and motivate you to continue on your healthy eating plan.
Motivate me? You mean manipulate me?
No, it's not manipulation. I'm being honest with you. I'm telling you, I'm trying to motivate you.
I don't like how it feels.
I don't like how it feels when you get stroppy when I try and help you grow and stop self-harming with food.
I know that, but you crossed the line.
But rather than get angry, I try time and time again to be nice to you. I'm not taking anything away from you because of your weight. You're getting pussy most men would kill for. Be grateful for that. It doesn't happen to just anybody.
That doesn't make me feel any better.
I don't know how to please you. You're doing my fucking head in.
I don't want you to have sex with me because you want to be nice to me. I want you to have sex with me because you want to.
But I do want to.
You want to have sex because you want to do a favour for me. You don't want to have sex with me because you desire me.
Well, if I only had sex when I felt desire, I wouldn't have sex with you for most of the past year.
Exactly.
You're angry because I gave you sex anyway. Do you realise how many men wish they were you?
I don't care.
Well, I think I'd like to ask you about this a little bit, because it seems like there's two kinds of appearance maintenance. There's the sort of appearance maintenance where a woman or man just wants to look at, their best. You can tell they've got interesting, well thought out fashion choices. They've got good makeup, good hair. They look squabbed. They don't look like they've had a shower, a week ago, and so on and so forth. So there's that kind of keeping your physical appearance okay. And then there's other women, sometimes men do this, but it's mostly women, where you can sort of tell they're not trying to look nice. They're trying to pop boners in the street.
I mean, that's subjective, and I don't judge. I know what I find appealing, and it's not really popping boners in the street look, that I find magnetic.
I mean, maybe an example of that from your point of view would be the Kardashians.
Yeah, and that's just not my thing. That's not my thing, but it's clearly a fair few people's thing because they have an enormous following, and I no more judge people who find the Kardashians beautiful than I judge you for not having sexy women on your wall.
Mm-hmm.
It's all acceptable preferences. We're all allowed preferences.
Right. I suppose the question isn't, should it be legal for them to do that? Obviously, I think pretty much everybody would agree.
No, I wasn't talking about legality. I was talking about whether I think that people are fundamentally better or worse based on what they find attractive. I suppose I might say that there is a fundamental lacking in someone who genuinely has no interest in who somebody is, only how they look.
So is your position that there's no fundamental difference between somebody who wants to look nice versus somebody who wants to pop boners in terms of what's healthy?
I would say that I would not judge someone who wants to pop boners harshly, because it's none of my business, and people go through phases, and sometimes there can be reasons. For example, how do you know, or how do I know, how does anyone know that a woman is not walking down the street in a boner popping outfit because she's trying to reclaim her sexuality after that power was taken from her, i.e., like a rape victim? Sometimes victims of rape respond to that trauma by deciding that from now on their sexual agency is going to be on their terms, and it might only last a year, and whether it does or not, it's just I think we should take a curious stance. I don't think that it's appropriate to look at a woman in a boner popping outfit and go, I know what you're all about. You are a superficial, vacuous whore. I think we don't know why she's doing that. Perhaps she's come from just, a basically repressive background. Maybe it's a rebellion against that.
Okay. Do you think there's anything wrong with being a shallow whore?
Yeah, I do.
What's wrong with it?
There's nothing wrong with being a whore. I think there's something wrong with being shallow. And what I think is wrong with being shallow is that it is not particularly productive. You don't add much to society as a shallow human being. And it's also unsustainable being shallow. If a shallow person, by my definition, is a person who exists in kind of two dimensions. And if you look at, a sort of vain, beautiful, shallow person whose only concern is how they look, for an example, human bodies are subject to change. They're not going to be able to maintain whatever it is that they think is their ideal. And therefore, they're setting themselves up to be miserable. To personalize it, I don't know if I would, I don't think it would be necessarily fair to say that I was shallow, but when I became a mother, I became two-dimensional, and I based my entire sense of self-worth on my proficiency as a mother. And I neglected every other part of me. And then I had a miscarriage.
Oh my God.
And that floored me, because I'd put all of my eggs in this motherhood basket, and then this event happened, through no fault of my own, but my emotional response was like, I thought I was a good mother, but I can't even carry a baby to term. And when I realized that little girl had died, at the 12-week scan, they said that she'd been dead for a couple of weeks based
Oh my God.
on the size. And so I was like, not only can I not carry a baby to term, but when my baby is inside me, I don't even know that it's dead. I mean, which, you kind of wouldn't, because before 12 weeks, there's no movement or anything like that.
Right.
But because I had put everything into believing that, this was my one thing, I was unable to cope with an event that threw that into question. And, I really, really, really struggled with that event. And so I imagine that if someone based their entire sense of self-worth on their physical attractiveness, well, there are a lot of, human bodies change, they age, worse things happen, and it's too big a risk. I would recommend against basing your self-esteem on any one thing. I think that we should all pursue a range of productive and valuable aspects of our personalities, so that if and when one fails or is derailed, we have other things, that we can concentrate on and still feel like we are valuable human beings.
Do you ever worry, though, that by wearing, let's say, the boner popping outfit, you're sending a signal that you don't feel confident enough to be attractive in something which is more about looking nice, where you kind of assume that once you show somebody who you are and once you show off your personality, you won't need to cause an erection in the middle of the street?
I don't personally worry about that, no, because I don't wear many boner popping outfits.
Most people don't. Most people don't.
But I mean, based on watching some of that trashy TV show, Snog, Marry or Avoid, do you remember that?
Yeah, that's, I think, the
Yeah.
intuition that was playing around with.
Yeah. So for, listeners who don't know, that was a show that took women who wore boner popping outfits and then paraded them through the streets and got people to say, no, I'd avoid her, she scares me, essentially. I mean, they said, would you snog, marry or avoid her? But it was never marry, was it? And then they, dressed them down a little, toned everything down, and then paraded them through the streets, and everyone said, oh, I'd marry her in an instant. And so, yeah, I think that there can be insecurities that are masked by outrageous clothing based on that. But who says what is an illegitimate way to deal with insecurity?
Yeah, that's a difficult one because there's a distinction between saying you're telegraphing insecurity, it's better to telegraph strength, but you might not actually be feeling insecurity in wearing the boner popping outfit. You might be feeling strength in a different way.
Yeah, I think it's very nuanced. And I guess I'm ultimately glad that, women, where they are free to dress as they please, are free to dress as they please. I think it's healthy to, I think it's all about, I think there's too much judgment. I think there's too much judgment generally in the world, and actually specifically for women and specifically from women.
Interesting.
And so, what I'm thinking of now is when I had my first child, and I was 20 when I gave birth to him, but I was very skinny and young looking.
How old are you now, if you don't mind me asking?
32 of them.
I can edit that out of the podcast if you want.
That's no problem.
Okay.
When I turned 32, I posted an image of me with a notebook, in fact, saying that I was the best 32-year-old. So it's not a secret. But yeah, I looked young. I was 20 and I looked young. And there were women, and only women, I never experienced it from many men, who took exception to how old I was, or they perceived that I was. The worst of which was I sat down in a local cafe with our eldest boy to enjoy a slice of cake and a cup of coffee. And the matriarch of the cafe walked over and actually had quite a go at me about how I was too young to have a baby. But, and here's the thing, I also got to know a lot of other mums, and I became particularly close to an older mum, and she'd had the exact same experience, but being told that she was too old and it was immoral for her to have a child at her age. I think we should all let each other be a bit more, like women specifically.
It sounds like these are social norms where women are policing each other. I don't hear too many men complaining about women having babies or not having babies, or even wearing slutty outfits. That seems to be mostly a complaint that comes from women.
Yeah, I think so, in my experience.
That's interesting. So the kind of feminine maternal judgment that says you should do what is proper, what is not slutty, you should be a good mother, but only when it's the right time.
And of course, there was actually a study that came out, God, it must be like a decade ago now, but the headline was like, our schools are full of slut shaming and all these poor girls are getting slut shamed all the time. But if you dug into the evidence within the report itself, it transpired that it was other girls slut shaming each other. Like there were articles and everything, and all the criticism was against boys. But if you read the report properly, it wasn't the boys who were slut shaming.
Well, there's a very obvious reason for that. Sluts give boys pleasure.
Indeed.
They do not generally give girls pleasure. I mean, maybe sluts are threatening because maybe women are worried that a slut will telegraph to all the boys that all the girls are open season. Maybe that's what the worry is. I don't know.
No, I mean, I'm of the opinion that it's intrasexual competition, and that, I mean, there's a good video actually by Greta Aurora comparing the Hera archetype and the Aphrodite archetype. And basically, the Hera archetype, which I think is quite prevalent, uses sex as a tool, as leverage in order to get her way. And as such, she guards it quite jealously. And the Aphrodite archetype is liberal with her sexuality, and she reduces the cost to men of, and so therefore Hera finds herself struggling to leverage her sexuality when it's going for free over with Aphrodite. I think it's a power thing.
So do women want to have power over other women?
Oh, well, not all of us, but I certainly think that too many do.
Interesting. So if a woman is threatened by another woman wearing a skimpy outfit or having a lot of promiscuous sex in an office, let's say, what do you think she's feeling?
Sorry, is the promiscuous sex happening in the office?
Yeah, I mean, suppose, for instance...
Or in public?
Well, let's put it...
On the photocopier?
Let's assume there's a new secretary who's very beautiful.
Right.
And rumor has it that she slept with 7 or 8 people in the office. There's another secretary in the office who is female, who's a bit older, who this makes quite uncomfortable. What do you think she's feeling?
I mean, I think it would be very much a sort of context thing. Like, it may be that she is simply jealous. It may be that these men paid her attention till this new secretary came along. On the other hand, it may be that the men are kind of getting at each other's throats because they are, all lusting after one woman. So I think it would be very much situation dependent there.
What if it wasn't really causing any friction in the office, but she just generally was repulsed by the idea that this new pretty woman was sleeping with all the people who used to be her colleagues, but they're now her lovers? Like, what do you think that feeling is?
I would have to ask her. I think it's very healthy not to assume, really. I would suspect I would get on better with the slutty secretary than the judgy secretary, but I might be wrong. I don't know.
Would you worry that the slutty secretary is using sexuality to manipulate everybody?
Not unless there was evidence to that effect.
So you wouldn't think, oh, she's doing it to get a promotion?
No, I wouldn't. No, not necessarily.
And if you were that secretary, if you were the older secretary, and then an attractive younger secretary came into your workplace, and then you noticed she was sleeping with 3/4 of your male colleagues.
Yeah.
Would you think, you go, girl, or would you think this is creepy?
I mean, again, it would be very much situation dependent. I would probably have some curiosity about what her motivation was. If, say, it was quite clear that I was more competent than her at my work, and then she did get promoted over me, I would probably be rather angry. but I wouldn't necessarily disapprove of her just for sleeping with people in the office.
I mean, I suppose you're a very unusual woman in that regard, because I think most women, if they were the older secretary, they would not like the younger secretary who comes in and sleeps with all the colleagues situation. I don't know too many women who approve of women who do things like that. I know a few, but not that many.
Yeah, I mean, I am very much of the, I was once a promiscuous young woman.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would be very rich of me to judge someone else for similar behaviour, for a start. I also was a promiscuous young woman because I was fixing things or plastering over things. And so I wonder, when people are doing anything compulsively, whether it's, eating or shopping or having sex indeed, whether actually there is something wrong, something that they're making up for.
How important is it to you what most women feel comfortable with? So if most women, as a general fact, just don't like promiscuous women, do you value that in the same way that you value most people liking the NHS, even if maybe that's less efficient than something else?
No, I don't care at all. I think that individuals and an individual's right to self-actualize, as long as they're not harming anyone else directly, is far more important than the tyranny of public opinion.
That was the Culture on the Offensive podcast. This is Greg Scorzo. So if you like this podcast, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And if you're interested in any of the other things that we do at Coda Publishing, check us out at www.cultureontheoffensive.com. The next main project that we'll be releasing from Culture on the Offensive will be my book, Post-Socratic Dialogues Love, coming out July 4th. If you're interested, you can hear 3 chapters of that book for free in my play Love Before COVID, which we will post a link to below. So stay safe, be courageous, and don't forget to go outside of your comfort zone. And remember, when you hear things that sound wrong or stupid or silly or strange, don't forget to use empathy, clarity, and courage.